It was a completely normal evening sky. A massive Boeing 747 was cruising comfortably at altitude, carrying hundreds of people who believed they were simply heading home for a holiday weekend. There was no severe weather. There was no unusual activity on the radar. The aircraft was climbing smoothly into the fading light of the setting sun, but then an explosive sound tore through the rear of the aircraft. In an instant, the cabin filled with a terrifying white fog. The massive machine began to violently pitch and roll, dancing a deadly rhythm high above the mountains. The pilots fought the flight controls, pulling and pushing with all their strength, but the aircraft stopped responding. The crew had no way of knowing the terrifying reality of their situation. A critical piece of their aircraft was simply gone. The passengers were trapped in a metal tube, flying completely out of control. But what really happened inside Flight 123? The date was August 12, 1985. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Tokyo's Haneda Airport to Osaka. The aircraft was a heavily modified Boeing 747 SR, specifically designed to carry a massive number of passengers on short domestic routes. On this particular evening, the plane was packed. There were 509 passengers and 15 crew members on board, many of them families traveling for the Obon Holiday Festival. The weather was clear, the winds were calm, and the flight was completely routine. The highly experienced crew, led by Captain Masami Takahama, completed their pre-flight checks without a single issue. The aircraft lifted off smoothly and began its climb toward a cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. Inside the cabin, flight attendants were beginning their standard service. Passengers were reading, talking, and settling in for what was supposed to be a quick, 54-minute flight. The steady hum of the four massive engines provided a comforting backdrop to a peaceful evening. But somewhere above the clouds, something had already begun to go wrong. 12 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft approached its cruising altitude over Sagami Bay, the calm was shattered. A sudden, deafening explosion echoed through the cabin. It was not a bomb, and it was not an engine failure, but the sound was so violently loud that it shook the entire fuselage. Immediately, a thick, blinding white condensation fog filled the passenger cabin. The air pressure dropped violently. In the cockpit, the crew heard the bang and felt the aircraft shudder. At first, it appeared to be a minor problem. The pilots assumed they had lost a cabin door or a window, causing a rapid decompression. They quickly donned their oxygen masks and began the standard procedures for an emergency descent. But within seconds, the situation changed completely. The explosive force had done far more than just let the air out of the cabin. Deep inside the tail section of the aircraft, a massive structural failure had occurred. The pressurized air from the cabin had blasted through a weakened bulkhead and rushed into the unpressurized vertical stabilizer, the tail fin of the aircraft. The sheer force of this escaping air blew the entire tail fin right off the plane. The 747 was now flying without its most critical stabilizing component. Worse still, the explosion completely severed all four independent hydraulic lines. Hydraulic fluid, the lifeblood of the aircraft's control systems, bled out into the freezing sky. In the cockpit, the reality of the nightmare began to set in. A warning appeared, then another. The aircraft responded differently. The crew realized this was no longer a normal emergency. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to sheer terror. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling panels. Automated announcements echoed through the freezing, fog-filled air, instructing passengers to put on their masks and fasten their seatbelts. The aircraft was violently oscillating, rising and falling in terrifying swoops known as a phugoid motion, plunging thousands of feet before suddenly pitching upwards again. It was a violent, sickening roller coaster ride. Flight attendants, fighting against the violent movements and the steep angles of the floor, did their best to calm the terrified passengers. But the people on board could feel the loss of control. They looked out the windows, seeing the horizon tilting wildly. Knowing that the end might be near, many passengers did something heartbreakingly human. They pulled out pens, grabbed flight sickness bags or small notebooks, and began writing final letters of goodbye to their families. Back in the cockpit, the crew was fighting the fight of their lives. Without hydraulics, the pilots could not use the elevators, the rudder, or the ailerons. The control yokes in their hands were completely useless. The aircraft was essentially a massive, unguided missile. The pilots tried desperately to regain stability using the only tool they had left, engine thrust. By increasing power to the engines on one side and decreasing power on the other, they attempted to steer the massive jumbo jet. They pushed the engines to their limits, trying to lift the nose, trying to turn back toward Tokyo. The aircraft was still flying, but the question was no longer whether they could continue. The question was how long they could remain in control. The first explanation seemed obvious. An explosion in the rear of the aircraft usually points to terrorism. But investigators soon discovered that it was wrong. The true cause of the disaster had been hiding in the dark for 7 long years. In 1978, this exact aircraft had suffered a severe tail strike during a landing. The tail of the plane had scraped hard against the runway, damaging the aft pressure bulkhead, a massive metal dome that seals the pressurized cabin from the unpressurized tail. Boeing engineers had repaired the damage, but they made a fatal mistake. Instead of using 2 rows of rivets and a continuous splice plate to bind the metal back together, they used 2 separate splice plates with only a single row of rivets holding the immense pressure. For 7 years, through over 12,000 flights, that single row of rivets weakened. Microscopic fatigue cracks grew with every single takeoff and landing. The metal was slowly tearing apart, hidden completely out of sight. For 32 agonizing minutes, the crew of Flight 123 performed an absolute miracle of airmanship. They kept the mortally wounded aircraft in the sky, fighting through violent rolling and terrifying dives, using nothing but engine throttles to navigate. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the aircraft was drawn toward the jagged peaks of Mount Takamagahara. Despite the crew's heroic superhuman efforts to pull the nose up one last time, the right wing clipped a mountain ridge. The aircraft flipped violently and slammed into the densely wooded mountainside. The impact was catastrophic. Rescue efforts were delayed until the next morning due to darkness and difficult terrain. When helicopters finally arrived, they found a scene of total devastation. Out of the 524 people on board, miraculously, 4 people survived. 520 lives were lost in the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. The investigation that followed uncovered the horrific truth of the faulty repair. The aft pressure bulkhead had finally burst like an overinflated balloon, sending a shockwave of pressurized air that destroyed the tail and doomed the flight. The cockpit voice recorder revealed the absolute bravery of the crew, fighting until the very last second without ever giving up. The investigation proved that no crew in the world could have saved that aircraft once the tail was gone. The failure was completely structural, a ticking time bomb created by a maintenance error 7 years prior. The official conclusion forced massive changes in how aircraft repairs were inspected and how structural fatigue was monitored across the entire global aviation industry. The legacy of Japan Airlines Flight 123 is one of profound tragedy and incredible human resilience. It changed maintenance oversight forever, ensuring that multiple layers of independent inspection verify critical repairs. The passengers on Flight 123 believed they were simply taking a routine flight, but somewhere inside the aircraft, a chain of events had already begun, and by the time the crew understood what was happening, there was no easy way back, because in aviation, disasters rarely begin with one single failure. Sometimes they begin with a warning that no one realizes is important until it is too late.